Episode 32, The Dark History of the Ku Klux Klan. Hey y'all, I'm Heather and this is Poison Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode on the alien invasion in 1973. I feel like we needed something a little light before going into this week's episode. I've debated doing this subject since I started. I know we're covering dark things in this podcast, but I feel like talking about the Ku Klux Klan brings light to things I don't really want to bring light to. I've always said I won't be political in this podcast, although I'm pretty political in real life, and I still won't be, but I feel like there's a lot of hate in this world, and hate can easily be spread. I may not be political, but one thing that I cannot abide by is racism or hatred. So maybe by discussing how something so evil came about, we can try to not let something like this happen again. They say we learn from history, so the past doesn't repeat itself, so let's learn some history here. In 1865, at the conclusion of the Civil War, 6 Confederate veterans gathered in Appalachia, Tennessee, to create the Ku Klux Klan, a vigilante group mobilizing a campaign of violence and terror against the African American people that benefited from the progress of the Reconstruction. So for those of us who have been out of school for a while, let me talk about the Reconstruction for a bit. The Reconstruction era was a period in United States history and Southern United States history that followed the American Civil War. It was dominated by the legal, social, and political changes of the abolitionists of slavery and the reintegration of the 11 former Confederate states into the United States. During this period, Congress passed 3 constitutional amendments that permanently abolished slavery, defined birthright citizenship, and guaranteed due process and equal protection under the law, and granted all males the ability to vote by prohibiting voter discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Congress also passed a series of Reconstruction Acts that divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts and laid out requirements for readmittance to the Union, except Tennessee. And I don't know why Tennessee, it didn't really say, so. But the experience of Reconstruction and the rebuilding of the Union following the Civil War played out across America and resulted in changes that fundamentally altered the meaning of citizenship and the relationship between federal and state governments. Central to this drama was the former Confederacy, where social, economic, and political changes dramatically transformed the region where major activity of and resistance to Reconstruction took place. African Americans across America faced steep obstacles as they attempted to claim their newly won rights. Ultimately, the unmet promises of Reconstruction led to the modern civil rights movement 100 years later. So as you can imagine, these so-called Southern gentlemen were not happy with the situation they were now living in, a situation that they themselves had created, to be honest. As I mentioned earlier, the original organization was founded in Appalachia, Tennessee, probably in May or June of 1866 by 6 young Confederate veterans. Its name reportedly derived from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle or band. Klan, though redundant, was appended to the name for alliteration. The Klan's founders devised a series of elaborate secret rituals for the organization, closely patterned after Ku Klux Adelphon, a college fraternity widespread throughout the South in the antebellum period. Officers consisted of a Grand Cyclops, or president, a Grand Magi, or vice president, a Grand Turk, or marshal, and a Grand Exchequer, or treasurer. Local chapters were called dens. In its early years, the Klan's regalia included a white mask with holes for the eyes, a high conical cardboard hat, and long flowing robes. So one of the articles I read said that initially the organization existed solely for amusement, but as it spread through the South, it became more and more associated with vigilantism and opposition to Republican rule. Now, honestly, I don't think they were ever just for amusement. I think they had ulterior motives from the beginning. In 2 years, they had enough groups that they had a convention. In the summer of 1867, local branches of the Klan met in a general organizing convention and established what they called an invisible empire of the South. Leading Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was chosen as the first leader, or Grand Wizard of the Klan. He presided over a hierarchy of Grand Dragons, Grand Titans, and Grand Cyclopses. A common report was that Forrest arrived in Nashville while the Klan was meeting at the Maxwell House Motel in April 1867, probably at the encouragement of former fellow CSA General turned state Klan leader George Gordon. The organization had grown to the point that an experienced commander was needed, and Forrest was well suited to assume the role. In room 10 of the Maxwell, Forrest was sworn in as a member by John W. Morton. Brian Steele Wills quotes 2 KKK members who identified Forrest as Klan leader. James R. Crow stated, "After the order grew to large numbers, we found it necessary to have someone of larger experience to command. We chose General Forrest." Another member wrote, "N.B. Forrest of Confederate fame was at our head and was known as the Grand Wizard. I heard him make a speech in one of our dens. The title Grand Wizard was chosen because Forrest had been known as the Wizard of the Saddle during the war. According to Jack Hurst's 1993 biography, 2 years after Appomattox, Forrest was reincarnated as a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. As the Klan's first national leader, he became the lost cause of the Confederacy's avenging angel, galvanizing a loose collection of boys' secret clubs into a reactionary instrument of terror still feared today. Forrest was the Klan's first and only Grand Wizard, and he was active in recruitment for the Klan from 1867 to 1868. Following the war, the United States Congress began passing the Reconstruction Acts to specify conditions for the readmission of former Confederate states to the United States, including ratification of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments, which I mentioned earlier. According to Willis, in the August 1867 state elections, the Klan was relatively restrained in its actions. White Americans who made up the KKK hoped to persuade black voters that returning to their pre-war state of bondage was in their best interest. Forrest assisted in maintaining order. After these efforts failed, Klan violence and intimidation escalated and became widespread. Author Andrew Ward, however, writes, in the spring of 1867, Forrest and his dragons launched a campaign of midnight parades, ghost masquerades, and whipping, and even killing Negro voters and white Republicans to scare blacks off voting and running for office. By the late 1860s, the Klan became one of the principal forms of opposition to the Reconstruction, and members were pledged to support the supremacy of the white race, to oppose the amalgamation of the races, to resist the social and political enrichment of carpetbaggers, and to restore white control of the government. From 1867 onward, black participation in public life in the South became one of the most radical aspects of Reconstruction, as black people won election to the southern states government and even to U.S. Congress. For its part, the Ku Klux Klan dedicated itself to an underground campaign of violence against Republican leaders and voters, both black and white, in an effort to reverse the policies of radical Reconstruction and restore white supremacy to the South. They were joined in the struggle by similar organizations such as the Knights of the White Camellia, launched in Louisiana in 1867, and the White Brotherhood. At least 10% of the black legislatures elected during the 1867 to 68 constitutional conventions became victims of violence during Reconstruction, including 7 who were killed. White Republicans, derided as carpetbaggers and scalawags, and black institutions such as schools and churches, symbols of black autonomy, were the targets for Klan attacks. To maintain white control of government, the Klan, joined by other white Southerners, engaged in a violent campaign of deadly voter intimidation during the 1868 presidential election. From Arkansas to Georgia, thousands of black people were killed. Similar campaigns of lynchings, tar and featherings, rapes, and other violent attacks on those challenging white supremacy became a hallmark of the Klan. During the presidential election of 1868, the Ku Klux Klan, under the leadership of Forrest and other terrorist groups, used brutal violence and intimidation against blacks and Republican voters. Forrest played a prominent role in the spread of the Klan in the southern United States, meeting with racist whites in Atlanta several times between February and March of 1868. Forrest probably organized a statewide Klan network in Georgia during these visits. On March 31st, the Klan struck, killing prominent Republican organizer George Ashburn in Columbus. The Republicans had nominated one of Forrest's battle adversaries, U.S. war hero Ulysses S. Grant, for the presidency at their convention held in October. Klansmen took their orders from their former Confederate officers. In Louisiana, 1,000 blacks were killed to suppress Republican voting. In Georgia, blacks and Republicans also faced a lot of violence. The Klan's violence was primarily designed to intimidate voters, targeting black and white supporters of the Republican Party. The Klan's violent tactics backfired as Grant, whose slogan was, "Let us have peace," won the election and the Republicans gained a majority in Congress. Grant defeated Horatio Seymour, the Democratic presidential candidate, by a comfortable electoral margin, 214 to 80. The popular vote was much closer. Grant received 3,013 votes, while Seymour received 2,708 votes. Grant lost Georgia and Louisiana, where the violence and intimidation against the blacks were most prominent. In an 1868 interview by a Cincinnati newspaper, Nathan Bedford Forrest claimed that the Klan had 40,000 members in Tennessee and 550,000 total members throughout the southern United States. He said he sympathized with them but denied any formal connection, although he claimed he could muster thousands of men himself. He described the Klan as a protected political military organization. The members are sworn to recognize the government of the United States. Its objects originally were protection against loyal leagues and the Grand Army of the Republic. After only a year as Grand Wizard in January 1869, faced with an ungovernable membership employing methods that seemed increasingly counterproductive, Forrest dissolved the Klan, ordered their costumes be destroyed, and withdrew from participation. His declaration had little effect, though, and few Klansmen destroyed their robes and hoods. But before that, the Klan's activity infiltrated the Democratic Party, campaign for the presidential election of 1868. Prominent ex-Confederates, including Forrest, the Grand Wizard of the Klan, and South Carolina's Wade Hampton, attended as delegates at the 1868 Democratic Convention held at Tammany Hall, headquarters at 141 East 14th Street in New York City. Former Governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate, while Forrest's friend Francis Preston Blair Jr. was nominated as the Democratic vice presidential candidate. Seymour's running mate. The Seymour-Blair Democratic tickets campaign slogan was "Our ticket, our motto. This is a white man's country. Let white men rule." The Democratic Party platform denounced the Reconstruction Acts as unconstitutional, void, and revolutionary. The party advanced the termination of the Freedmen's Bureau and any government policy designed to aid blacks in the southern United States. These developments worked to the advantage of the Republicans, who focused on the Democratic Party's alleged disloyalty during and after the Civil War. The presence of the KKK helped create the Jim Crow laws in the South. A little bit about the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws in U.S. history are any of the laws that enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel routine performed during the 1828 by its author, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, and by many imitators, including Joseph Jefferson. The term came to be a derogatory epithet for African Americans and a designation for their segregated life. From the late 1870s, Southern state legislatures, no longer controlled by so-called carpetbaggers and freedmen, passed laws requiring the separation of whites from persons of color in public transportation and schools. Generally, anyone of ascertainable or strongly suspected black ancestry in any degree was for that purpose a person of color. The pre-Civil War distinction favoring those ancestry was known to be mixed, particularly the half-French free persons of color in Louisiana, was abandoned. The segregation principle was extended to parks, cemeteries, theaters, and restaurants in an effort to prevent any contact between blacks and whites as equals. It was codified on local and state levels, and most famously with the separate but equal decision of the United States Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. In 1954, the Supreme Court reversed Plessy in the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. It declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, and by extension, that ruling was applied to other public facilities. In the years following, subsequent decisions struck down similar kinds of Jim Crow legislation. So that's a little bit about Jim Crow. Now back to the Klan. After a short but violent period, the First Era Klan disbanded when it became evident that the Jim Crow laws would secure white supremacy across the country. However, the legacy of the original Klan and the figureheads of the Confederacy before it have been enshrined across the country in the cult of the lost cause. Only in recent years, after gaining significant attention through large counter-protests and after deadly attacks from far-right extremists, have states and localities started removing these statues and renaming public spaces. On July 9, 2020, Tennessee State Capitol Commission voted to remove the bust of Nathaniel Bedford Forrest from the State Capitol building. It was subsequently removed on July 23, 2021, and placed in the Tennessee State Museum. So finally, the Ku Klux Klan was gone, right? Wrong. In 1915, white Protestant nativists organized a revival of the Ku Klux Klan near Atlanta, Georgia, inspired by their romantic view of the Old South, as well as Thomas Dixon's 1905 book, The Klansman, and D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation. The resurgent group began in Georgia, where William J. Simmons dedicated it at a cross burning on Stone Mountain on Thanksgiving Eve, 1915. The success of D.W. Griffith's epic film of the same year, Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman, with its vivid portrayals of radical Republican excesses, and helped to fan the flames of racial animosity, which had smoldered since Reconstruction. In addition to the group's anti-black ideological core, the second iteration of the Klan opposed Catholic and Jewish immigrants also. A growing fear of communism and immigration broadened the Klan's base throughout the South and into the Midwest, with a particular stronghold in Indiana. It was fueled by growing hostility to the surge in immigration that America experienced in the early 20th century, along with fears of communist revolution akin to the Bolshevik triumph in Russia in 1917. The organization took as its symbol a burning cross and held rallies, parades, and marches across the country. The new Klan retained its namesake's antipathy to blacks and its penchants for secrecy, the wearing of masks and sheet-like outfits, and vigilante-style violence. It also employed a special terminology for members, inventing words that began with the letter K, such as Chloran, its handbook, Clavern, a local branch, and Clud, a chaplain. It charged $10 to join, of which recruiters got a cut, and held a monopoly of selling Klan uniforms and regalia to members. As KKK membership grew into the millions by the early 1920s, the money poured in. The Second Klan could easily be as violent as a Reconstruction-era ancestor, but it was more fraternal and social, though its brand of socializing was restrictive to native-born Protestant whites. It supported the recently enacted national prohibition of alcoholic beverages and opposed labor unions, immigration, and foreign entanglements such as the League of Nations. Klan members and leadership disliked Wall Street and big business in general, and chain stores in particular, said National Klan leader Hiram Evans. Increasing economic inequalities threatened the very stability of society. The rise of industrialism and consumerism presented bewildering changes that the Klan blamed on stereotyped Jewish bankers on Wall Street. Unlike the early Klan or the Klan of the 1960s, the 1920s Klan, although founded in the South, was not exclusively Southern. It boasted support nationwide, primarily in the Midwest. In 1924, more than 40% of all Klan membership could be found in just 3 states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. But the Klan also secured significant support in Maine, Colorado, and Oregon, where it helped ban Catholic schools. It enjoyed a small-town base, but it also appealed to the big city Protestants with large chapters in cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Dallas, and Indianapolis. In the South, most members were Democrats. In the North, such as Indiana, most were Republicans, though Milwaukee had a fairly large socialist membership. Of course, the Klan was much more than just a social group or a business network. It was especially hostile to blacks, Catholics, and Jews. The original Klan had been specifically formed to combat freedoms for freed slaves, and the new Klan continued that trend. As one West Virginia Klan leader proclaimed, the Klan believes in white supremacy, or as its official national newspaper, The Searchlight, theorized, race forms the basis for all human actions and reactions. The Klan also opposed and disparaged Jews, painting them alternately as predatory capitalists and dangerous radicals. But its main focus was against Americans' rising Catholic population. Catholic immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, French Canada, and Southern Germany had poured into the country by the millions in the previous decades, competing with native-born American workers for jobs and driving down wages. The great majority of Klan members were Protestant who feared Catholics because they were convinced that the average Catholic was completely under the thumb of his or her parish priest, or worse, a foreign authoritarian church hierarchy led by the Pope. Most Klansmen, noted historian David Chalmers, did not believe that they were opposing the Catholic Church because of its religion, but because hierarchical control from Rome prevented his assimilation. Or as Alabama's U.S. Senator J. Thomas Heflin put it, God has raised up this great patriotic organization, the Klan, to unmask popery. Although not every Klansman was violent, far too many were. Members perpetrated lynchings, arson, beatings, and whippings. In September 1921, the New York World reported the judgment of a disgusted former Klan member. It would be impossible to imagine an attitude more essentially lawless. Ku Kluxism, as conceived, incorporated, propagated, and practiced, has become a menace to the peace and security of every section of the United States. Its evil and vicious possibilities are boundless. It is nothing more or less than a throwback to the centuries when terror instead of law and justice regulated the lives of men. At its peak in the 1920s, Klan membership exceeded 4 million people nationwide. By 1925, when its followers staged a march in Washington, D.C., the Klan had, in some states, considerable political power. A series of sex scandals, internal battles over power, and newspaper exposés quickly reduced the group's influence. Just as quickly as the Klan rose in membership and influence, however, it collapsed. There were many reasons. Some members were embarrassed by the organization's bigotry, some by its silly regalia and ceremonies and its money grubbing. Others were repulsed by the violence or its hypocrisy. I actually read that Harry Truman was a member of the Klan, just really for a short time, and once he found out what it was about, he asked for his money back. The Klan's most fatal weakness was rooted in its poor leadership. The organization claimed to stand for morality, but its leaders provided the worst possible examples. For example, Edward Y. Clark and Mary Elizabeth Tyler, 2 Atlanta-based publicists whose masterminds the Klan's skyrocketing rise, were soon revealed to have been arrested in 1919 for sexual impropriety and possession of illegal alcohol. Then, with millions of dollars rolling in, infighting for control grew fierce, and Klan founder and Grand Wizard Colonel William Simmons found himself ousted by Houston dentist Hiram Evans. Evans was allied himself with perhaps the Klan's most successful personality, Indiana Grand Dragon David G. Stevenson. Stevenson, a former socialist and a failed Democratic congressional candidate, had quickly engineered a Klan Klan takeover of Indiana's Republican Party. Clearly, the most powerful man in Indiana, Stevenson, who said, "I am the law in Indiana," viewed himself as a future senator and perhaps even the president of the United States. In 1925, however, the 33-year-old Stevenson forced his aide, 28-year-old Madge Oberholzer, into a Chicago-bound train where he assaulted and raped her. She attempted suicide, but her death a few weeks later was ruled to have followed from infection of the wounds Stevenson had inflicted on her. A jury found Stevenson guilty of rape, kidnapping, and second-degree murder. The Klan imploded after that, although popular anti-Catholicism flourished in 1928 when Catholic New York Governor Al Smith unsuccessfully ran for president. The second Klan had long since declined, though. So before I go into the third iteration of the Klan, I wanted to mention this. I always knew about the racism, of course. I mean, we all do. And I knew about the anti-Semitism, but I didn't know about the Catholics. I remember reading in history books when JFK became president that it was a big deal because he was Catholic, and I thought, why would that even matter? Because it didn't mean anything to me. But reading this history, it makes more sense. It's still ridiculous, but at least I do understand it a bit. Throughout the second and third eras of the Klan, many Black Americans left southern states in the Great Migration. While those who moved north were seeking economic prosperity and social opportunities, they were also hoping to escape the racial terror centered around the Klan's ideological stronghold in the South. With over 6 million Black Americans taking part in this migration, the demographics of the country shifted dramatically. Now on to the third revival of the Klan. The Civil Rights era in the 1960s saw a surge of local Klan activity across the South, including the bombings, beatings, and shootings of Black and white activists. These actions, carried out in secret but apparently the work of local Klansmen, outraged the nation and helped with the support of the civil rights cause. In 1944, Samuel Green, an Atlanta physician, attempted to revive the KKK in the form of the Association of Georgia Klans, which emphasized white supremacy and anti-communism. After Green's death in 1949, however, several other Klan groups organized, leaving the movement hopelessly fragmented. In contrast to the powerful Klan of the 20s, which had drawn many of its membership from the social mainstream, these groups were typically small, fanatical, and on the fringes of respectable society. The U.S. Supreme Court's Brown v. Education decision in 1954 mobilized Southern whites in a movement of massive resistance to federal mandates for desegregation, and the Klan emerged as a major player in that movement. In 1955, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan formally organized in Atlanta, and the following year the group staged another rally atop Stone Mountain with an estimated attendance of 3,500. The group was extremely violent, as demonstrated throughout the 50s and 60s by hundreds of attacks against African Americans and white supporters of the civil rights movement. Targets in Georgia included Koinonia Farm, a biracial community in Sumter County, African Americans demonstrating against segregated businesses in downtown Atlanta, and Lemuel Penn, an African American military officer from Washington, D.C., who was murdered while driving through Madison County. These groups used cross burnings, beatings, bombings, and murder to intimidate civil rights activists and local Black communities. During this period, the group often forged alliances with police departments and state officials to further their cause. The U.S. government revived the Force Acts in 1963 when Mississippi officials refused to prosecute KKK members for the murder of 3 civil rights workers, James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodwin, and Michael Schwerner. On September 15, 1963, a dynamite bomb exploded in the back stairwell of the downtown 16th Street Baptist Church. The bombing was committed by a white supremacist terrorist group. 4 members of the local Ku Klux Klan chapter planted 19 sticks of dynamite attached to a timing device beneath the steps located on the east side of the church. Described by Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. The explosion at the church killed 4 girls and injured between 14 and 22 other people. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing marked a turning point in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement and also contributed to the support for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by Congress. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson delivered a speech publicly condemning the Klan and announcing the arrest of 4 Klansmen in connection with the murder of a white female civil rights worker in Alabama. In the fall of 1966, unidentified individuals bombed an African-American church in Richmond. Because the incident smacked of Klan-like activity, civil rights groups such as the Virginia chapter of the NAACP pressured Governor Mills Godwin to officially condemn the Klan. In December, he finally did, singling out the cross-burning as a reprehensible act long associated with the record of bigotry compiled by the Ku Klux Klan that must be stamped out. Eventually, this violence forced federal authorities to act against the KKK. The Federal Bureau of Investigation used an extensive network of informers to disrupt Klan activities in Georgia and other southern states. Their efforts proved effective, and by the early 1970s, the FBI estimated there were fewer than 2,000 active Klansmen in the nation. The cases of Klan-related violence became more isolated in the decades to come, though fragmented groups became aligned with neo-Nazi or other right-wing extremist organizations from the 1970s onwards. During the late 1960s and 70s, the KKK shifted its focus to one opposing affirmative action and immigration and court-ordered school busing. In 1971, KKK members blew up school buses in Pontiac, Michigan in an attempt to stop court-ordered school desegregation plan. With the conclusion of the Vietnam War in 1975 and the subsequent return of American soldiers, several key figures rose within the Klan. Louis Beam, upon his return from Vietnam, joined the Alabama-based United Klans of America. His teachings on leaderless resistance and early adaptation to technological advances helped bridge neo-Nazi and Klan groups into the organized white power movement. In the mid-1970s, an independent faction in Louisiana, under the leadership of David Duke, a recent Louisiana State University graduate, attracted new recruits from across the nation, and the sizable pockets of Klansmen affiliated with other groups persisted elsewhere. In the 1980s and 90s, the militant racism and anti-Semitism of those Klansmen led them to a close relationship with such organizations as the Aryan Nations and other neo-Nazi factions. In 1987, a parade celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and led by Hosea Williams in majority-white Forsyth County, inspired violent counteraction by two Klan organizations, which eventually led to a 1993 court order forcing one of the groups to disband. During the early 1980s, the Klansmen gained new notoriety for its attacks on Vietnamese shrimpers along the Gulf Coast in Texas. In the waning years of the 20th century, various Klan groups forged links with skinheads and other neo-Nazis, and despite numerous legal actions, continued to be an irritant. In 1991, former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke ran for governor of Louisiana and finished ahead of incumbent Governor Buddy Roemer in the gubernatorial primary election, a stunning upset that garnered international attention. The possibility that a former Grand Wizard might be elected governor created a media firestorm and made the 1991 Louisiana gubernatorial election the most closely watched in the country. Duke's campaign lost steam when advocacy groups such as the NAACP and major corporations threatened to respond to a Duke victory by mounting an economic boycott of Louisiana, whose economy depended on tourism. As a result, former Governor Edwin Edwards defeated Duke by a margin of 61% to 39%, though Duke won slightly over 50% of the white vote. Despite the persistence of racism, the Klan largely failed to stem the growth of racial tolerance in the South in the late 20th century. Though the organization continued some of its surreptitious activities in the early 21st century, cases of Klan violence became more isolated and its membership had declined to a few thousand. The Klan became a chronically fragmented and made up of several separate and competing groups, some of which occasionally entered into alliances with neo-Nazi and other right-wing extremist groups, as was the case of a demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 that erupted in violence, resulting in the death of a counter-demonstrator. As of 2016, the Anti-Defamation League estimated Klan members to be around 3,000, while the Southern Poverty Law Center said that there were 6,000 members total. Through a series of court cases aimed at bankrupting the Klan and closing the group's paramilitary training camps, the organization has been weakened. Internal fighting and government infiltrations have led to an endless series of splits, resulting in smaller, less organized Klan chapters. Given the Klan's insistence on remaining an invisible empire, it's nearly impossible to estimate how many active members there are today. However, it's fair to assume that the infighting, rigid traditions, and uncouth image of the Klan are not attracting significant new membership. Which, I don't know. Not nowadays. But unfortunately, there are other hate groups to fill that void. There's a lot of hatred in this world right now, and I don't know how to stop it all. But I think a good way to start is to not feed these hatred groups. Let them combust in upon themselves. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "I have decided to stick to love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." I think we all need to stick with love for now, more than ever. So that's it for today. As always, thank you for listening. If you haven't followed me on social media, follow me under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, TikToks, Threads, Blue Sky, YouTube, Eliminate. Check out my website at poisonappalachia.com. And if you can, please like, rate, and share me on whatever podcast platform you listen to. Thanks, y'all.